Hi folks! In this tutorial I'm going to demonstrate how to create a simple photo or art gallery in Blender and then export it into Sketchfab so that you can share a 3D view of your images with others. So this is what I see when I open up Blender 2.91. I've got a cube, a light, and a camera. I don't need the light or the camera in the 3D viewer on Sketchfab because it has its own. So I'm just going to delete those and select the cube. This cube is going to be the walls of our art gallery. Here I'm showing how you can flip back and forth between orthographic and perspective view modes by pressing the number pad 5 key. Perspective view distorts the view to mimic what our eyes see, so that areas closer to the viewer appear larger and things farther away appear smaller. Orthographic flattens the view artificially, which is great for making precise movements we need like position, scale, and rotation. I want to go into the orthographic front view by pressing the number pad 1 key, where it's easier to see when I move the entire cube up in the Z-axis that it's resting on top of the floor, which is the red line, or the X-axis. Next, I'm showing how you can snap objects into place incrementally. I'm using G to move the objects around. You can also enable constant snapping from the UI here. The control button temporarily activates the snapping settings and deactivates when you release it. I usually leave that setting off and I only activate it when I need it. Here I'm demonstrating that in the Properties panel, which you can access by pressing the letter N, you can adjust dimensions of the object directly. By default, changing the height of the object affects the cube from its center instead of where I wanted to from the floor. So here I am showing that you can move and use the 3D cursor as the origin point for any transformation by switching the transform pivot point to the 3D cursor, the little red and white dotted circle icon. For now, I'll just reset the cursor to the center of the world and set my tool to box selection again. Under Object Set Origin, I'm going to make the pivot point of this cube be where the 3D cursor is, in the middle of the world. That way, any transformation will happen from the bottom center. This way I can raise the roof to 14 feet, which is a pretty typical height for a tall ceiling. And here you can see that I enter in real-world measurements. And even though the default unit is meters, if I just enter feet after the numbers, then Blender understands and converts the measurements into meters for me. So now I have a box that's 28 feet wide, 14 feet high, and 14 feet deep. This is our basic art gallery room. Currently, you can't see inside the box for two reasons. One is because the object's normals are facing outward. Normals are the direction a 3D object is facing in space, and two, because our viewport is set to show everything in a solid shaded mode. By enabling backface culling, I'll hide faces whose normals are pointing away from the view. Here I show where you can toggle the X-ray view on and see the surroundings through the mesh at certain angles. We don't need that right now though. What we need is for the walls of the box to face inward, so I'm going to go into Edit Mode. You can do this by choosing Edit Mode from the menu here or by pressing the Tab key. To flip the normals, you can select Mesh, Normals, Flip, or use the hotkey combo, which is Alt plus N, and then select Flip. Now I know it's hard to see, but the walls of the gallery face inward as intended. Now that we're ready to bring artwork into our gallery, I'm going to go back to my startup file for just a moment. I would ordinarily choose File, then Import to find images as planes to bring in the images for my gallery. But when your Blender installation is new, only the most commonly used plugins are enabled by default to keep everything uncluttered. So here I show how to enable pre-installed plugins by going under Edit, Preferences, and then I select the Add-ons tab and type in a keyword like Import so that it appears in the list of search results. Then click the checkbox next to it. This selection gets saved by default, and now I can choose Import Images as Planes. Back at the gallery, I'm just going to Shift select 10 to 15 images, and then all of these default settings work just fine, except I want to change the scale of each image to be at least 6 feet in height, and then space them about 2 feet apart. Then I'm going to choose Y negative for the alignment so that they're facing the viewport. As you can see, the little gizmo in the upper right-hand corner shows you which direction you're currently facing. Now to show all of the images, we can go to the drop-down next to the viewport shading icons and choose Texture. That doesn't affect how these will appear on Sketchfab, but it lets us see what we're working with. Alright, now I'll go back into front orthographic view and pressing G+Z to stay in the up axis, I'm going to move them just up a little bit. Here I'm showing that you can select objects individually in the view with left click, or over here in the text panel, that's called the outliner, you can use Shift to select a bunch by their names and then Control to deselect individual objects like the gallery cube from the list. What I'd like to do next is give all of these a bit of thickness like a portrait on a canvas. So I'm going to enter into edit mode again. And then under Mesh Extrude, I choose Extrude Faces, or I just press E. Then I'm going to use snapping by pressing Control, which results in steps a bit too big for this. So combining Shift with Control will slow down the movement and make the increments just a bit smaller to give them a nice 0.1 meter thickness. If I move my view to the back here, you can see there's an extra face that no one will ever see when it's up against a wall. In 3D, it's really important to remove anything that won't be seen because otherwise it slows down your rendering. Here's where I want to choose the right mode for selecting just the faces on the back. You can cycle through vertex selection, edge selection, and face selection modes up here in the left-hand corner, or you can press the upper 1, 2, or 3 keys on your keyboard for the same operation. To get rid of those unwanted back faces while we still have the original faces selected, we're going to use an operation called Face Step, which simply takes whatever you have selected already and then increases the selection area by one face at a time on each side adjacent to your selection. To do that, we press Ctrl and then the number pad plus sign just once. Now I have all but the back faces selected. I choose Ctrl plus I to invert that selection so that only the unwanted faces are selected, and then I can press delete and confirm the operation for just faces. We're almost done. So now I want to select just a few of the images to place on the back wall of the gallery cube. I'm going to change the snapping tool setting from increment to edge. I'm also going to enable snap with active instead of closest so that the snapping is based on the outer edges of the active object, which is highlighted in yellow. The distinction of an active object versus other selected objects in orange is important because the active object is the one that will be the basis for your operation. Now using G plus Y to constrain the movement to the Y-axis and Control to enable snapping, I'm going to move my mouse in the direction that I want these objects to go, and look for a circle to appear on the surface of the wall that I want the active object's edges to snap to. Then I press the left mouse button to confirm. If I switch to the top orthographic view using the number pad 7, I can see that these three images are properly aligned against the wall, and I can move them more to the center of the x-axis by pressing G and X. It's looking good. Next, I'll select the images I want to go on one of the side walls. Since our scene's pivot point is still set to the 3D cursor, pressing R plus Z to rotate them on the Z-axis makes them rotate way out of the frame, so I can right-click to cancel that and switch the pivot point back to bounding box. R plus Z, then type -90 and click Enter to confirm. Now when I rotate the images, they move around the center of all of the selected objects instead. G and X to move them towards the wall in the X-axis with Control to snap them in place again. G and Y to align them towards the middle of the wall on the Y-axis. Continue this way until the whole gallery is filled with images. I don't need any of these other images, so I will use the Box Select tool by just left-clicking and dragging in the viewport. Then I will invert the selection again with Ctrl I. I just press delete, and now my scene has the basic structure of a 3D gallery. In order to make sure that these images are going to be included in the file when I import it into Sketchfab, I'm going to go up here to File again, choose External Data, and then select Pack All into File. Note that you'll want to be sure that altogether your images are at a small enough file size so that the blend file doesn't exceed the limit of your Sketchfab account type. Now I'm off to sketchfab.com, where I've already signed up and logged into my account. Sketchfab offers a free user account with limited numbers of free uploads per month. While your file uploads, you can enter a title, a description of your upload, and assign it to different categories, and even add keyword tags so people searching on the site can find your content. Just save before you go on to click Edit 3D Settings. When you click this button, you'll see your uploaded object in the viewport with a panel of options and tabs on the left. You can use your left mouse button to grab and rotate your object in the view. This will only change how your object displays if you choose to press the Save View button in the upper left. Some other options you can adjust here are the field of view, which switches gradually from 0 degrees, which is essentially orthographic, and at the other end of the range it's not really usable, so I like to leave it in the default of 45 degrees. If you're going to be seeing outside of the object, you want to adjust the background, which can be a solid color that you can change with the color picker right here. If you have a pro account, you can also upload images for the background. For an art gallery to look like you're really inside it, you're going to want to control how it looks to the viewer. So scroll back up to the camera settings and enable Limit Orbit Camera. This opens up the control panel where you can choose whether to limit the ability to pan around, which means moving left to right, limit the zoom, or limit the rotation of the vertical and horizontal axes. While you're setting this up, the Exit Preview button is there if you need it, but you should pan around, zoom in, and move this little gizmo until it's in the approximate spot where you want your viewers to first see your scene, and then you can click Set from View for the max zoom in and max zoom out. I'm setting the max zoom in to 0 because I want you to be able to zoom in on the art, but setting the max zoom out to my current location so that viewers won't zoom outside of the box. Now I'll move on to the Lighting tab. By default, there will be a high dynamic range image lighting the scene. As you can see, if you cycle through these, it will change the overall lighting in the scene. For this demonstration, I'm going to turn off the environment light altogether. If you scroll to the top of this tab, you can turn on virtual lights, and if you click Load Lighting Preset, you can choose from 6 preset light rigs that each include 2 or 3 directional lights in different positions with different color and intensity settings. If I exit out of the camera lock preview mode, it'll be easier for you to see that these directional lights are technically outside of the box and can be moved around. They can also be set to a different type of light entirely, such as point light, which is what I'll do here. Directional lights are infinite, whereas point, spot, and hemi lights are all limited. Point lights are limited to a sphere, a spotlight to a cone, and hemi are infinite, kind of like directional lights, but only in half of a sphere. Note that each lighting setup will be better or worse for your scene depending on your assets. For example, I might just try changing all of these lights to point lights, but feel free to experiment with different presets and adjust each individual light to your liking. Ground shadows is a setting that will fake shadows on an imaginary ground plane, but that's better suited to models that don't already have a floor like our gallery does. Environment lighting is typically better for an open or outdoor environment, at least in part because it lets light leak in through these back faces that I talked about earlier. Moving on to the Material tab at the top, you'll see that you can scroll through every single material for every object in your scene. When you click on the material in the Sketchfab editor, the object is highlighted in yellow for a moment to help you identify what you're working with. In order to make the lighting more natural, I'm going to set the Faces Rendering option on the walls to single-sided. All of the images are still set to double-sided by default, as you can see from the shadows on the floor, but we don't have to mess with that if we go back to the Lighting tab and use lights inside of the walls. If we go back into the Materials tab and make sure we have the gallery walls selected, we can change the overall color of the cube object via the color picker in the Base Color drop-down menu. If you have a texture map to the object, you can import it via this dialog as well, but texture mapping is a bit beyond this particular demo. There are a number of other settings here that you may want to play with, like metallic and roughness, and even specular highlights. Emission is a particularly interesting one because you can set any object to be emissive and it will act like a light in the scene if you use any color other than the default black. But that's not very useful for a plain wall. Next, we will take a look at the Post-Processing tab. Starting with the effects I like to use most, there's SSAO, which stands for Screen Space Ambient Occlusion. I don't know about the screen space part, but ambient occlusion refers to shadows that appear between adjacent surfaces. And here you can see that it adds a lot of depth immediately to the scene. We can also adjust how far that shadow extends with the radius setting. The intensity controls how dark it is, and the bias, I'm not entirely sure what it does, but maybe it affects the distance. Something near the default always works fine for me. The grain setting gives everything a film grain effect. Screen space reflections aren't typically very useful unless you have something shiny that needs to have accurate reflections of surrounding objects. Back down to the depth of field, this is a pretty handy setting for giving a cinematic effect where the objects in focus are what you want the viewer to pay the most attention to, and the objects you want the viewer to ignore are out of focus. Here it's obvious that I have the roughness of the walls set too low because you can see that the specular highlights are shining back at you, so I just go and turn that down. Sharpness is another of my favorite effects because it really makes the details in textures pop. Chromatic aberrations aren't really all that useful in my experience. It gives a halo of red and green to everything. Vignette is nice because it adds dramatic shadows at the edges of the view, but it can be a bit overpowering, so I like to turn it down a bit depending on the situation. Bloom just spreads out and cranks up any of the highlights in the scene, which can be very dramatic if you have an object that's supposed to emit light, such as a candle. It can also be very overpowering, though, and not really appropriate for a simple gallery. Finally, we have tone mapping, which allows you to adjust the scene like a photograph, increasing and decreasing exposure, brightness, contrast, and so forth. And color balance, which gives you finer control over different hues in the scene. I typically don't use these because I work really hard to get the settings right in my textures instead. Anti-aliasing smooths out jagged edges made by square pixels, but it's hard to show what effect it's having on this scene. Just make sure you test it, especially if your object is meant to be viewed very close up. So that wraps up my tour of the post-processing filters, and now we'll look at the annotations panel. This is where, by double-clicking, you can add a text box anchored by a marker that will show up whenever your viewer clicks on the little arrows at the bottom of the screen or on the numbered circles. Later on, you'll see that by enabling these annotations, I inadvertently disabled the zoom lock feature. So once I've entered in some text, I can rotate the view around, double-click again, write some more about this other point I want viewers to read about. When I click back and forth, I can preview how the viewer will be shown the text boxes that I input in sequence. Lastly, I'll show you how to set this up for viewing in VR. As you can see, my avatar starts out a little bit too large for the space, but since I built the scene in real-world scale, I can just set the Sketchfab viewer scale to 1, and my little avatar will be approximately the same size as a human being in a 14-foot high room. There are other settings in here you might want to tinker with depending on what you uploaded, such as the floor level, but because we set up the scene relative to world space in Blender, everything else works fine by default. You can also add audio to your scene with controls for whether the sound starts by default or when the viewers press play. But the next thing we need to do is make sure we save our settings, and then we can press publish. Right away when the scene loads, we're kind of looking at the corner because I didn't save a startup view. This is where I go back into the Edit 3D settings. And then I realized that zoom lock was disabled because I added annotations. That's okay though, I can just go back into the annotations tab and delete them one by one, and then in the camera settings I can re-enable the lock. Then from the published scene, I choose a more appealing position for my viewer to start from, and click that button in the upper left that says Save View. The very last step is to share my scene. If you scroll down, there's both a share button and an embed button. If you click share, the embed options will also appear, and you can customize how the viewer will appear when it's embedded on web pages. Other than that, you just need to click copy link and share. Then when the shared link is loaded, the view starts exactly where you wanted it to, and your viewers can look around.